It began not with a crown, but with blood. A child born in the wrong month to the wrong queen. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world on a grey September day in the year 1533, and before she could even speak, the kingdom had already begun sharpening its knives for her. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded before Elizabeth turned 3. Her body buried without ceremony. Her name spat upon in corridors where it once echoed like prophecy. Her father, King Henry VIII, called her a bastard. The court stripped her title, tossed her from palace to palace like unwanted furniture, and the kingdom turned its eyes to the next heir. Yet somehow, through shame and silence, she survived. She watched her father marry again, and again, and again. Wives who bled out in bedsheets, who died in childbirth, who were cast aside or executed. Elizabeth learned early that women in her family did not get old. She understood that a smile could be a weapon, that the right silence could save your life, and that no man, not even your father, would protect you when power was at stake. She was 14 when Thomas Seymour began visiting her chamber in the early morning hours, robed in lust and whispers. She did not scream. She did not tell. She wrote in Latin, in a trembling hand, "Nolito tangere me, let him not touch me." She survived him, too, and when they beheaded him for treason, Elizabeth did not cry, not once. By the time her half-sister Mary rose to the throne, and Elizabeth was dragged through the Tower's gates, locked in the same stone rooms where her mother had waited for death, the girl who had once been called princess no longer existed. In her place was a ghost with red hair and a mind of steel. For 2 months she lived under threat of execution, questioned, isolated, watched for signs of guilt. But Elizabeth said nothing, confessed nothing, and gave them nothing. She mastered the art of stillness. When they released her, it was not because they believed her innocent, it was because they could not prove her guilty. And in Tudor England, survival was the rarest miracle of all. When she became queen at the age of 25, England was already breaking apart. The treasury was nearly empty. The Catholics called her a heretic. The Protestants called her not Protestant enough. And in every corner of Europe, kings circled like wolves, offering marriage not out of love, but as a way to control her. Elizabeth smiled at them all and said no. She never married. She never named a successor. Instead, she turned her virginity into legend and made her body a fortress no man could conquer. With every proposal she rejected, she bought another year of independence for England. And behind that smiling mask, she watched and waited and prepared to kill. She remade the Church of England in her image not through open war, but through razor-edged legislation and soft words laced with poison. Over time, priests who defied her disappeared. Those who held mass in secret were hunted, fined, imprisoned, or hanged. Nearly 200 Catholics died during her reign, not because they rose in rebellion, but because they dared to worship in silence. Others paid in coin recusancy fines, so steep they ruined entire families. They were taxed for missing church, bled dry for believing in the Pope, and taught that the cost of faith was everything they had. Elizabeth said she would make no windows into men's souls, but she burned down the houses that held them. And yet she was beloved. The poets called her Gloriana. The nobles bent their knees and kissed her hand. Foreign ambassadors feared her. Even when they mocked her, she spoke Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and Greek. I could quote scripture better than most bishops, and played one court against another. like a master conductor. Her parliament begged her to marry. She answered, "I am already wedded to England." Her courtiers prayed for a male heir. She gave them 27 years of rumors, teasing, and then silence. Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, plotted against her, stood at the center of every Catholic conspiracy, and remained a living threat for nearly 2 decades. But Elizabeth did not move quickly. She waited, and when the time was right, she signed the warrant that led to Mary's execution and never spoke of it again. She ruled through performance, through illusion, through the careful construction of myth. She painted her face white as bone, thick with lead and fear. She wore wigs and jewels and armor again. She became, in time, not a woman, but a symbol untouchable, unknowable, immortal. But symbols cannot bleed, and Elizabeth bled in silence. Every year she reigned, another piece of herself died. She lost her youth, her friends, her suitors. She became surrounded by spies, forced to navigate plots and betrayals from within her own walls. Every decision cost blood. Every victory carried ghosts. And when rebellions came, she crushed them with such fury that even the dead could not escape her message. After the Northern Rebellion, she ordered at least 600 public executions, hangings in every village, gallows built in marketplaces, rotting bodies left as warnings to all who dreamed of Catholic resurrection. In Ireland, she let the land starve. Her armies burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and left fields soaked in famine. Entire clans were erased. The policy was called plantation, but it grew nothing but graves. When soldiers surrendered, she ordered them butchered anyway. And though she rarely visited the island herself, her name became a curse whispered by widows and children who watched the sky for English sails. But she ruled still. She ruled through terror, through beauty, through brilliance. She ruled because no one else could. Elizabeth reigned for 45 years. She lived through assassins, invasions, betrayal, and plague. When she died in the year 1603, she left no heir, no child, and no husband. Only a country that had grown powerful under her reign, and a long list of those buried beneath it. She was not less cruel than her father, Henry VIII, who chopped off heads by the dozen. She was not less fanatical than her sister, Mary, who burned Protestants alive. She was something else entirely. Her cruelty was slower, more elegant. It was law, not fire. It was silence, not screams. It was the kind of violence that came with a signature, a fine, or a whisper behind a locked door. They called her the Virgin Queen. They built golden myths around her. But this is not a bedtime story. This is the story of a woman who built an empire from the ashes of her own pain. A woman who learned to smile while cutting your throat. A queen who never married, but made love to power itself. And though her body turned to dust centuries ago, her crown still weighs heavy on the neck of every ruler who dares to follow. Because Elizabeth Tudor did not simply wear the crown, she became it. She was not supposed to survive. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of the most scandalous queen in English history, was born beneath a prophecy that died the moment her mother's neck met the French sword. When she died in the year 1603, she left no heir, no child, and no husband, only a country that had grown powerful under her reign, and a long list of those buried beneath it. She was not less cruel than her father, Henry VIII, who chopped off heads by the dozen. She was not less fanatical than her sister, Mary, who burned Protestants alive. She was something else entirely. Her cruelty was slower, more elegant. It was law, not fire. It was silence, not screams. When she died in the year 1603, she left no heir, no child, and no husband, only a country that had grown powerful under her reign, and a long list of those buried beneath it. She was not less cruel than her father, Henry VIII, who chopped off heads by the dozen. She was not less fanatical than her sister, Mary, who burned Protestants alive. She was something else entirely. Her cruelty was slower, more elegant. It was law, not fire. It was silence, not screams. And she learned, quickly, to be silent, to listen, to memorize the architecture of fear. She watched the men in velvet robes speak of justice and God, while they quietly signed the orders to destroy women like her mother. She watched the women in silks lower their eyes when her name was mentioned, afraid their gaze might offend the memory of the dead queen who had dared to love too boldly. But Elizabeth did not ask for pity, even as a child. She understood that no one would offer it, not for girls like her, not in a court ruled by shadows and suspicion. Her education became her refuge. In the pages of Latin scrolls and the measured logic of Aristotle, she found structure where her life had none. She read theology and history and philosophy, not to be wise, but to be armed. Each lesson was a weapon she added to her arsenal. By 16, she could speak fluently in 6 languages, hold her own in theological debate, and translate ancient Greek poetry faster than most priests. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, once said that she had no womanly weakness, that her mind was a storm of discipline and control. But he did not understand that it was not the absence of weakness that made her exceptional, it was the presence of pain, and the way she had learned to chain it down, to use it like fire. She had seen what happened to women who showed too much. 3 stepmothers gone, 2 dead, 1 discarded, a 4th who tried to love her and paid for it with her dignity. And then came the 5th, Catherine Parr, the stepmother who tried to offer warmth, who took her into her household, who offered her a place to rest. But Catherine remarried too quickly, and the man she chose was Thomas Seymour, a charming, reckless man who found amusement in visiting Elizabeth's bedchamber before dawn, dressed in nothing but a nightgown and a grin. He tickled her, kissed her, and cut her dress with a dagger while laughing. Everyone said it was just play, just mischief, just flirtation. But Elizabeth was not laughing. Not then. Not when she wrote her secret note in Latin to Catherine, begging her to keep him away. Not when Catherine caught them alone and sent Elizabeth from the house. And not when Catherine died in childbirth, and Thomas came back. It was only after Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason that the crown turned its gaze on Elizabeth once again. She was 15. He was accused of plotting to marry her and seize the throne. And so they questioned her. They interrogated her with the same cold fingers they had used on her mother. They demanded to know what he had said, what she had felt, what she had done. But Elizabeth gave them nothing. No tears, no tremble, no confession, only silence, only survival. When they told her Seymour was dead executed, she did not react. They thought she was cold, but in truth, she had known all along that this was the price of being noticed. Women who were looked at for too long in this court did not live long. By the time her sister Mary became queen, Elizabeth had mastered the art of invisibility. But power, no matter how carefully avoided, clings to some people like oil to cloth. When Wyatt's rebellion broke out in the year 1554, a Protestant uprising against Mary's Catholic marriage to the King of Spain, Elizabeth was implicated. Whether she had anything to do with it no longer mattered. She was accused, and that was enough. On a grey March morning, she was brought by boat to the Tower of London. Passing through Traitor's Gate, the same gate her mother had entered before her execution, the people lining the shore watched in silence. The river knew the truth before the court did. They were not bringing a girl to prison. They were bringing a queen into the storm that would forge her crown. For 2 months, Elizabeth slept in the very apartments where Anne Boleyn had waited for the sword. She was interrogated, examined, surrounded by guards, who looked at her like a riddle they had been ordered to break. They found no confession, no flaw, no guilt, just a young woman with eyes too sharp for her age, and a mouth that gave nothing away. She kept her secrets sealed like coffins. And when they finally released her, it was on the anniversary of her mother's death. A coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps a warning. From there she was sent to Woodstock Palace, a gilded prison in the countryside, where she scratched a single line into a window pane with a diamond, much suspected by me. Nothing proved can be. Elizabeth the prisoner, when she returned to court after Mary's false pregnancy and slow decline, she was changed. She had survived the Tower. She had survived the accusations. She had survived the echo of Anne Boleyn's fate. And now she waited. She waited through Mary's sickness, through her fading reign, through the whispers that circled the court like birds over carrion. And then one day, it was over. Mary was dead. The crown, heavy with suspicion and soaked in blood, was passed to the girl no one had expected to last a season. Elizabeth was crowned queen on a cold day in January of the year 1559. She was 25 years old. The people cheered. The bells rang. And behind her painted smile, Elizabeth counted the ghosts in the crowd. Her mother, Seymour, the rebels, the sisters, the priests, the servants who had bowed before her as a child and vanished when the crown turned against her. She had outlived them all, but she had not forgotten them. And she knew that the throne did not forgive, did not forget, and did not protect. It simply waited for weakness, for failure, for any sign that the child of Anne Boleyn might stumble. So she built her reign on silence, on masks, on the art of saying nothing with such grace that it sounded like prophecy, and from the ashes of 1,000 betrayals, she began to rule. Because she had learned something no man in England had yet understood. Power is not taken. It is survived. And she had been surviving since the day they cut her mother's head from her body. The woman who emerged from the Tower was no longer merely the daughter of Anne Boleyn or the girl they had once called bastard. She was something colder, sharper, and more deliberate than she had ever been before. Every step she took after that moment was measured not in distance, but in control. She spoke carefully, breathed cautiously, and never again allowed her heart to beat too loudly. And when the crown was finally placed upon her head, it was not with triumph, but with silence. Elizabeth Tudor did not ascend the throne of England as a queen ordained by God. She arrived like a survivor, returning to the scene of the crime, dressed in golden armor stitched from secrets, suspicion, and scars, and the kingdom, hungry for miracles, desperate for stability, pretended not to see the iron cage she carried behind her eyes. The early years of her reign were a balancing act, danced atop blades. England was broke. The crown's debts stretched like a noose around her neck, and religious division festered in every corner of the land. Half the country still clung to the old faith. whispering prayers to Rome in secret, lighting candles for a pope who had already disavowed their queen. The other half wanted more reform, more fire, more proof that the Virgin Queen was the Protestant answer to the terror that had come before. Elizabeth gave them both a mask. Her first parliament asked what kind of church England would be. She responded with a smile, a prayer book, and 2 laws soaked in quiet rebellion. The Act of Supremacy named her supreme governor, not head of the church, a subtle maneuver to sidestep theological minefields. The Act of Uniformity enforced a new version of worship, cobbled together from old bones and fresh ideas. With enough ambiguity to comfort the doubters and terrify the radicals, but behind that mask of moderation, something darker unfolded. Resistance, at first, was soft. Some priests resigned, some fled, some whispered, and Elizabeth, with the patience of a woman who had lived in prisons, allowed it for a time. But the longer she sat on the throne, the less tolerant she became of those who would not kneel. Over 800 clergy were removed or walked away by the mid-1560s. Hundreds of Catholics fled to the continent, some to train in seminaries where returning to England meant returning to death. But Elizabeth was not satisfied with distance. She wanted obedience. And so the law became sharper. Recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, were fined. First, in pennies, then in pounds, until faith itself became an economic burden too heavy to bear. One missed mass became one day's wages. By the time the fines rose to £20 per month, religion was no longer a matter of the soul. It was a matter of survival. Still, Elizabeth claimed she did not seek to make windows into men's souls, that her kingdom had room for all who obeyed the crown. Regardless of belief, the Act of Uniformity enforced a new version of worship, cobbled together from old bones and fresh ideas. With enough ambiguity to comfort the doubters and terrify the radicals, but behind that mask of moderation, something darker unfolded. Resistance, at first, was soft. Some priests resigned, some fled, some whispered, and Elizabeth, with the patience of a woman who had lived in prisons, allowed it for a time. But the longer she sat on the throne, the less tolerant she became of those who would not kneel. Over 800 clergy were removed or walked away by the mid-1560s. Hundreds of Catholics fled to the continent, some to train in seminaries where returning to England meant returning to death. But Elizabeth was not satisfied with distance. She wanted obedience. And so the law became sharper. With him came Francis Walsingham, her eyes and ears, the master of her spy network, a man who believed that knowledge was power and that fear was the surest way to keep a queen alive. Together, they constructed something no ruler in England had ever fully possessed: a state that could see, hear, and strike in silence. And yet, for all her brilliance, for all her power, Elizabeth remained alone. The question of marriage followed her like a hound at the heels of a hunted thing. Parliament asked, ambassadors begged, foreign princes sent portraits and promises, but she refused them all. Some said it was pride. Others said it was grief. But the truth was more cruel. Elizabeth knew that the moment she gave herself to a man, she would no longer belong to the crown. She had seen what marriage did to women in power. It turned queens into vessels, consorts into threats, love into leverage. She had loved once Robert Dudley, the handsome courtier whose wife died mysteriously, whose nearness always caused gossip to rise like smoke. She made him master of the horse. She danced with him. She whispered to him in corners. But she never let him closer than the mask allowed. And when smallpox struck her in the year 1562, when death came close enough to kiss her cheek, she named Dudley her protector, not her husband. That was the closest he would ever come. Her body became the battlefield for every diplomatic game. Spain offered Philip II, her dead sister's widower. Austria sent archdukes. France dangled dukes like bait. She flirted with them all, played them against each other like cards in a royal hand, always keeping the game alive, but never laying it down. Her unmarried status became a weapon, her womb a threat, her silence a strategy. No one knew her plans, because she kept them hidden even from herself and England, watching from beneath the weight of years, as began to worship her, not as a woman, but as a myth. They called her the Virgin Queen, but the virginity was never the point. The absence of a husband was not a symbol of purity, it was a shield, a refusal to surrender her sovereignty to any man, foreign or domestic. Her body became national property. Her heart, a locked chamber, guarded by duty. She gave herself to her people. She said she was married to England, but this marriage was loveless. It required no heirs, no tenderness, only performance. And the Queen performed beautifully. And yet, as the court whispered of suitors and succession, the real threats did not come from outside England. They came from within, from Catholics who still believed her a heretic, from nobles who remembered Mary, Queen of Scots, from men who saw her as a woman first and a monarch second. They plotted. They prayed for her downfall. They moved in shadows and sent letters soaked in poison. But Elizabeth, ever the ghost child of the Tower, had not forgotten how to survive the silence. She had not forgotten how to kill without lifting a finger. And soon, the crown would begin to tighten around her temples, not like a garland, but like a chain, because even a queen cannot wear iron forever without bleeding beneath the gold. The shadow that haunted Elizabeth Tudor did not wear armor. It did not raise armies. It did not even speak her name in public. It wore pearls, held a crucifix, and waited patiently behind locked doors under English guard. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin, her mirror, her opposite, her greatest threat, a woman crowned in infancy, adored in France, widowed young, married again in scandal, and then again in blood. Mary was the Catholic answer to Elizabeth's Protestant silence, everything Elizabeth feared becoming, and everything her enemies hoped to replace her with. Mary was the womb, the beauty, the divine right. But Elizabeth was the crown, the silence, the survivor. And the world knew that it was only a matter of time before one of them would have to destroy the other. When Mary fled Scotland in the year 1568, accused of conspiring to murder her own husband and marrying the man most suspected of the crime, she sailed to England, seeking sanctuary. Instead, she was placed under guard. But this marriage was loveless. It required no heirs, no tenderness, only performance. And the Queen performed beautifully. And yet, as the court whispered of suitors and succession, the real threats did not come from outside England. They came from within, from Catholics who still believed her a heretic, from nobles who remembered Mary, Queen of Scots, from men who saw her as a woman first and a monarch second. They plotted. They prayed for her downfall. But before Elizabeth could deal with her cousin, she had to put down the country's most dangerous rebellion. It came from the north, a place of wild hills and older loyalties, where Catholic faith still burned under the skin like fever. The rebellion of the Northern Earls in the winter of 1569 was not merely a protest, it was a prayer turned into war. They marched under the banner of Christ's 5 wounds. They tore down the Protestant Book of Common Prayer and brought back the Latin Mass. For a brief moment, it looked as though the old world might rise again. Elizabeth answered with vengeance. She sent over 20,000 royal troops to crush the uprising. The rebels, poorly organized and without support from abroad, collapsed before Christmas. But Elizabeth was not content with victory. She needed blood. She demanded that at least 700 be executed as punishment, not the noble leaders, not the generals, but the poor villagers who had followed. They were hanged from trees, from gallows, from the gates of their own towns. Some were killed before their families. Some were displayed for weeks. And their corpses, a message to the rest of the kingdom. The earls escaped, one into exile. One eventually captured and beheaded. But it was the common people who paid. The queen, who spoke of mercy in Latin, struck with terrifying precision in English. It was the largest judicial execution spree of the century. And it worked. But violence has echoes. And in Rome, the Pope heard them. In the year 1570, Pius V issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, excommunicating Elizabeth and declaring her no longer queen in the eyes of the Church. He called her a pretended queen, a servant of wickedness, a heretic to be cast down. More dangerously, he released her subjects from their loyalty to her. It was, in effect, a license to kill, divinely approved rebellion. Elizabeth did not flinch. She tightened her laws. She built prisons. She expanded her network of spies. Catholicism in England became not just forbidden, but treasonous. It was now illegal to harbor a priest, to hear Mass, to convert, even to be reconciled with Rome. Recusancy fines multiplied to levels that could bankrupt families. Nobles had to choose between their faith and their fortune. And slowly, strategically, Catholicism was erased, not with fire, as her sister Mary had done, but with ink, with law, with hunger. But Mary, Queen of Scots, still lived. And worse, she still inspired hope. She became the figurehead of every foreign plot. Her letters, smuggled in code and carried by servants loyal to the old ways, became threads in a growing web of conspiracy. In the year 1571, the Ridolfi plot emerged, an attempt to assassinate Elizabeth, marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk, and place her on the throne with the aid of Spanish forces. It failed, intercepted by Walsingham's spies. The Duke of Norfolk was executed. Mary was spared. But the message was clear: as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth would never sleep peacefully. And so the state turned darker. Francis Walsingham expanded his spy network across the continent. He used double agents, ciphers, forgeries. He turned servants into informants and letters into weapons. Elizabeth gave him the freedom to operate in shadows. Because she understood now what all monarchs must eventually learn: fear is governance. You do not need to kill your enemies if you can make them afraid to speak. The mask of the Virgin Queen grew heavier, the paint thicker, the eyes colder. And still, Elizabeth refused to marry. She told Parliament she was wedded to England. She mocked the idea that a woman needed a husband to rule. But she also understood what they truly feared, that her refusal to name an heir meant that the future remained unwritten, that any day could be the last day of Protestant England, that every Catholic priest caught at the border might be bringing with him the next chapter of civil war. And she let them fear it. because that fear kept them loyal. That fear kept them quiet. It was a masterclass in statecraft, by ambiguity, and no one could play that game longer, or better, than Elizabeth. But even masters grow tired. Even queens bleed in secret. She had begun to age. The mask of white lead she wore daily to cover scars and illness now also covered the erosion of time. Her teeth blackened. Her hair thinned. Her temper shortened. The nobles still flattered her. The poets still sang of Gloriana. But in private, they whispered of decay. And behind the throne, Mary still waited, still plotted, still breathed. Elizabeth did not want to kill her cousin. But someday soon, she would have to, because one crown had already bled for Anne Boleyn's daughter, and England could not afford to bleed again. By the time the ink dried on the letter that would condemn a queen, Elizabeth Tudor had already spent nearly 2 decades pretending she could avoid it. The blood of Mary Stuart had haunted her reign since the first day, whispering treason in cathedral alcoves and breathing rebellion into the ears of exiled Catholics from Lisbon to Rome. Elizabeth had locked her cousin away in castles, surrounded her with spies, intercepted her letters, and crushed the uprising she inspired. But Mary still lived. And worse, Mary still symbolized something holy to those who believed Elizabeth's crown was a lie forged by a bastard. But Elizabeth had never wanted to kill her. Not just because they shared blood. Not just because of what it would mean for queens across Christendom. But because she knew what it meant to be a prisoner, waiting for silence to fall like a blade. Elizabeth had once looked out the same tower window, heard the same footsteps echo in judgment, felt the same air, cold and waiting. To kill Mary would be to kill a piece of herself. But by the year 1586, that piece had become too dangerous to spare. It began, like many deaths in Elizabeth's court, with a letter. The Babington plot was meant to be perfect. A coded message hidden in beer barrels. A network of devout Catholics, young and burning with purpose, trained abroad and planted like seeds of war. Their goal was simple: assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and raise a Catholic rebellion backed by Spain. But they did not know that every step had already been seen. Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, had built something more than a security apparatus. He had built a surveillance state long before such words existed. He let the plot grow. He let it fester. And then he caught it by the throat. The conspirators were captured, interrogated, and butchered, hanged, drawn, and quartered in public squares, their bodies torn apart as a warning written in flesh. But Walsingham had saved the most damning evidence for last Mary's own handwriting, approving the assassination of the English Queen. The letter sealed her fate. Still, Elizabeth hesitated. She delayed the trial. She delayed the warrant. She blamed her council, her secretaries, the weight of justice. She called for prayers. She walked alone in gardens. She wrote furious letters and then tore them to shreds. She knew that history would not forget what she was about to do. Killing a queen was not like killing a rebel. It was a crack in the order of the world. It was killing God's anointed. Even if the crown called it justice, the heavens might call it murder. But justice no longer belonged to heaven. It belonged to the crown. And Elizabeth had worn that crown long enough to know that sometimes it needed blood to shine. On the 8th of February, in the year 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. She prayed aloud in Latin. She forgave her executioners. It took 2 blows to sever her head. And when it rolled forward, her wig came loose. revealing thinning gray hair. A small dog, hidden in the folds of her gown, ran out and curled itself beside her body. Blood soaked the boards. Silence followed. Elizabeth claimed she had not signed the warrant, that it had been sent without her final approval, that her counsel had moved too quickly. She punished her secretary, tore at her own hair, and wrote frantic letters to foreign courts, insisting she had meant only imprisonment. But no one believed her. Not truly, because they knew the truth. She had waited too long to kill Mary, and now she had waited too long to pretend it was not what she wanted. The ghost of Mary Stuart never left her. Not in the halls of court. Not in the eyes of Catholic Europe. Not in the face of the storm that now rose across the sea. Philip II of Spain had waited long enough. He had tolerated the death of his wife, Mary Tudor. He had endured Elizabeth's insults, her refusal to marry, her constant flirtation with his enemies. But the execution of Mary, a Catholic queen and cousin to the Pope, was the final insult. Philip raised the largest naval fleet the world had ever seen. They called it the Invincible Armada, a procession of galleons, firepower, and saints carved into the bows of warships. His priests blessed the decks, his sailors sang psalms, his admirals whispered of crusade. This was not just war. This was vengeance wrapped in silk. Divine wrath carried on the tide. And in the year 1588, it came for England. Elizabeth did not tremble. She rode out in armor. She stood before her troops at Tilbury, dressed in silver and steel, and told them that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. She told them she would live or die amongst them, that she had no fear of Spaniards, popes, or tyrants. She made war sound like love, and duty sound like poetry. Her speech became legend. Her crown became myth. And the Armada, invincible in name, was broken by storms, scattered by fireships, and shattered by English cannon fire along a coast that refused to bow. But it had not been certain. For weeks, the country had waited in terror. They dug trenches. They lit beacons. They buried their treasures. They watched the horizon like men awaiting Judgment Day. And when the danger passed, they did not forget who had stood between them and fire. Elizabeth had killed a queen, but in return, she had saved a kingdom. And yet, the war did not end. Spain sent more fleets. Ireland burned with rebellion, fueled by foreign gold. Jesuit priests still crossed the channel with blades hidden beneath their robes. And Elizabeth, now aging, now more mask than woman, began to drift further into solitude. Her court still danced. Her poets still praised. Her nobles still knelt. But behind their eyes, they whispered about her teeth, now black and aching, about her wigs, heavy and lifeless, about the long nights where she paced alone, surrounded by portraits of men who had died long before her. Her closest friends were gone. Robert Dudley, the only man she had ever loved, was dead. His steps echoed no more in the palace halls. His son, the Earl of Essex, would try to take his place and fail spectacularly. But that was still to come. For now, England called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who had never married, never bent, never yielded. They printed her face on coins, her speeches in pamphlets, her image in the stars. But the woman beneath the crown, the woman who had once scratched much suspected by me, nothing proved can be into a window pane, knew better. She knew the crown was never won, only kept, and every day she wore it, Something else died inside her. By the time Elizabeth Tudor entered her 6th decade of life, the woman was vanishing beneath the myth. She had become a figure sculpted in ritual, layered in lead, wrapped in silks, lips painted crimson to conceal rot, and wigs towering so high they shadowed her spine. The courtiers still bowed, still praised. It still sang her name in verse and victory. But behind closed doors they whispered what they could not say aloud, that the queen no longer smiled with ease, no longer heard with clarity, no longer breathed, without the stench of illness coiling from her mouth like a secret trying to escape. What they saw was a sovereign, still radiant in gold. But what they smelled was decay. Every morning began with the ritual, the mask. It was not simply paint, it was penance. Her face was scrubbed raw to erase the yellowing skin beneath, then coated in layers of white lead paste, deadly and heavy, until no trace of woman remained. Her cheeks were powdered, her eyes ringed with kohl to feign youth, and her lips drawn into a smile that never moved. The teeth beneath were crumbling, blackened at the roots, and it was said that her breath could silence a room before her voice even arrived. But no one dared speak of it. Her presence was still command, her words still law, and in that silence, her courtiers played along, because Elizabeth did not allow time to claim her. She fought it with artifice, with theater, with an image so rehearsed that even she began to forget where the mask ended and the woman began. But inside, she knew. She knew because the nights were longer now, the dreams more cruel, the hallways colder, and when she passed the tapestries in Whitehall and Hampton Court, she no longer saw the triumphant Virgin Queen. She saw the child in the tower, the girl who had once feared the sound of guards outside her door, the woman who had signed her cousin's death warrant with hands that trembled long after the ink dried. Her crown still fit, but only because her skull had narrowed beneath the weight of it. Her court, though still obedient, had begun to change. The old guard was dying. William Cecil was gone. Francis Walsingham, her spider, her shadow, her shield, had returned to the dust. Robert Dudley, the love she never named, had been buried in an alabaster tomb she never visited. The ones who remained had new ambitions. Younger blood, Louis de Valois, the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. Dudley's son was beautiful and impulsive, hungry for favor and blind to danger. Elizabeth indulged him at first, watched him dance, watched him swagger, watched him promise what he could not deliver. She gave him gifts, let him grow close. But even in her indulgence there was calculation. He reminded her of Dudley, but Dudley had known fear. Essex did not, and that would be his ruin. By the year 1599, Essex had failed in Ireland, disobeyed orders, returned without permission, and barged into the Queen's chambers before her mask could be applied. What he saw was not a queen, but a woman, undone wigless, aged, bare-faced and breathless. And Elizabeth, in that moment, Eve saw the flicker in his eyes, not admiration, not love, not even pity but judgment. And from that moment, he was already dead. The following year, Essex led a rebellion against her government. Foolish and short-lived. He was arrested, tried, and executed. Elizabeth signed his death warrant in private. No tears, no explanation, just silence, because she had learned long ago that to rule was to bury those who forget how to kneel. But with each death came another crack in the myth. The poet still called her Astrea. The goddess returned, The coin still bore her profile, but the world beyond England had stopped fearing her. Her navy had weakened. Her coffers had drained. Spain still circled. France still watched. And Ireland still burned in rebellion. At home, Puritans pushed from one side, Catholics from another, and Parliament murmured of succession. But Elizabeth would not speak of it. She refused to name an heir. She had seen too clearly what that meant, how naming a second made the first a corpse in waiting. She had lived her life with a dagger at her back. She would not leave that same blade for another. So she ruled on, alone, unmarried, without heir, without comfort. Her ladies grew weary. The music in court grew thinner. And in her chambers, Elizabeth began to remove the portraits that showed her as a goddess. She preferred the ones in shadow, the ones that could not be seen clearly. She had grown tired of her own reflection, because beneath the paint, the white lead was poisoning her. Her skin peeled in flakes. Her hair fell in clumps. Her breath reeked of the grave. And still she rose each morning to be dressed as if for war. This was not vanity. This was survival. The illusion had to be preserved. Because if the court saw the woman decaying, the kingdom might see the throne crumbling. And Elizabeth had not held the kingdom together for 4.5 decades to let it fall in her final days. She wore her sickness like a second crown. She hid her pain like a priest, hiding forbidden mass. And when she spoke, it was still with the clarity of a ruler who had outlived everyone who dared question her. But the mask was slipping. Not just the paint, but the legend itself. The country wanted future. It wanted stability. It wanted to know who would wear the crown next. And Elizabeth gave them nothing. Not James of Scotland. Not any English noble. Not even a whisper of possibility. Because to name a successor was to confess mortality. And she had denied that longer than anyone else in Europe. But her body had started telling the truth that her mouth refused. She stumbled more often. She forgot names. She wept without warning. She spoke to ghosts in the hall. And though the sun still rose and fell at her command, even it seemed hesitant now. The court began preparing behind her back, drafting plans, quietly reaching out to James, positioning themselves for a world without her. But none dared move openly, because the queen still breathed, still ruled, still listened, and her punishment still came without warning. In the final winters, she would sit for hours without speaking. Her fingers curled around rosary beads she did not believe in. She refused food, refused warmth, refused her bed. She stood for hours in black velvet, eyes open, unmoving. Some said she was waiting for Dudley. Others said she was waiting for death to speak first, so she could interrupt it with command. But death had learned patience, and so it stood at the edge of the room and watched her. Just as she had once watched Mary Stuart, just as she had once watched her own mother disappear into the blade. Elizabeth Tudor, born in disappointment, crowned in blood, robed in legend, had survived everyone. But the mask was cracking, and the breath that once commanded empires now smelled of endings. She had once said she would rather be a beggar woman and single than a queen, and married. And though the line had drawn admiration and awe from poets and parliament alike, it was not the whole truth. Elizabeth Tudor had loved. Not foolishly, not openly, but deeply, and with a fury she kept locked beneath the rituals of court and the language of duty. She had once watched Robert Dudley, the man the court dared to call her consort without crown, dance across her youth like a flame she could never hold. And when he died, in the year 1588, Elizabeth had locked herself in a room for days and refused to eat. The world believed her heart had died with him, but what they did not understand was that Elizabeth did not allow her heart to die. She preserved it in ice. And from that frozen place, she tried to love again. He was young, too young, but he had his father's eyes and his father's swagger. And that was enough. Robert de Vereux, the second Earl of Essex, was Dudley's stepson, and Elizabeth saw in him not only echoes of the past, but the cruel illusion of what might have been. She adored him. Yes, but like a lioness watching her own reflection in the water. Full of grace, full of danger. Essex was ambitious. He craved attention, craved triumph, craved the applause of a country that still saw Elizabeth as eternal. And Elizabeth, perhaps too hungry for devotion, fed his pride. She named him Master of the Horse, showered him with titles, praised him in public, and endured his insolence in private. The court watched in silence, for they had learned what happened to those who laughed too soon. But power never shares its shadow. And Elizabeth, aging, weary, but still sovereign, would not let a man step into the sun beside her. When Essex began to speak over her in council, she noticed. When he refused to bow, she remembered. When he turned his back before being dismissed, she wrote his name in a ledger that only she read. And when he failed disastrously in Ireland, sent to put down rebellion, but instead signed an unauthorized truce, Elizabeth did not scold him. She did not rage. She waited. Then, in an act that sealed his fate, he broke into her chamber one morning, without permission, without ceremony, while she sat without her mask. She was not ready, not painted, not armored. Her real face lined, mottled, with thinning hair and breath steeped in clove and decay, was exposed. And he saw her, and she saw him seeing her. And in that single, burning moment, something broke. The days that followed were filled with silences that Essex mistook for forgiveness. And when she spoke, it was still with the clarity of a ruler who had outlived everyone who dared question her. But the mask was slipping. Not just the paint, but the legend itself. The country wanted future. It wanted stability. It wanted to know who would wear the crown next. And Elizabeth gave them nothing. Not James of Scotland. Not any English noble. Not even a whisper of possibility. Because to name a successor was to confess mortality. On a cold February morning in the year 1601, Essex raised a small rebellion. He stormed into the city with less than 200 men, hoping the people would rise to his side. They did not. The court did not panic. Elizabeth did not tremble. The rebellion collapsed within hours. Essex was captured and dragged before the Privy Council, like a dog returning to the gate it once pissed on. They tried him for treason. He begged. He wept. He named names. And finally, Elizabeth signed the warrant. It was not rage that moved her hand. It was discipline. Essex had made her feel mortal, had looked at her not as a queen but as a woman in decay. And Elizabeth had learned, again and again, that to rule was to destroy anyone who knew your weakness. On the morning of his execution, Essex asked to see her. She refused. He died on Tower Hill, beheaded with 3 strokes. His head was not held aloft. No triumph, just silence. Some said Elizabeth mourned him, that she kept a ring he had once given her, that she whispered his name when no one was listening. But whether that was grief or legend, no one could tell, because the queen who had once wept for Dudley had learned, by now, to bleed only inside. The court moved on. The calendar turned. The country breathed without him. But something inside Elizabeth did not. She grew colder. Not in policy, those had long since been made icy and precise, but in spirit. The entertainments grew fewer. The progresses stopped. Her favorite musicians died or left court. The halls that once rang with dance and poetry now echoed only her footsteps. And as her world emptied, she retreated further into ritual. More paint, more pearls, more speeches that sounded like echoes of a woman who had once believed in her own voice. She could no longer hear clearly, could no longer sleep through the night. She had begun to speak to shadows, asked where Dudley had gone, asked what time it was. Though the sun had not yet risen, her women waited with gowns and fans. But sometimes she refused to be dressed, sat in the cold for hours, unblinking, refusing the crown, the cloak, the mirror. They whispered that she was dying. But Elizabeth had been dying since the day she was born. What they were witnessing now was not death. But departure. The slow retreat of a legend into silence. The unraveling of a woman who had never been allowed to be anything else. And as the kingdom braced itself, as Parliament drew up secret oaths of allegiance to James of Scotland, as the bishops prepared sermons, and the nobles aligned themselves with tomorrow, Elizabeth sat in her chamber with the ghosts of men she had loved and buried. She had survived them all, but she had not escaped them, because love, like treason, leaves a stain on the crown that no paint can hide, and sometimes the hardest signature to write is the one that kills what little remains of your heart. By the final winter of Elizabeth Tudor's life, the palaces had grown too large for her. The ceilings echoed with nothing. The courtiers moved more carefully, whispering softer, watching her eyes for signs of decline, of confusion, of surrender. And though the Virgin Queen still held her head high beneath the mountain of jewels and white lead, something in her had begun to fray. Her days were shorter, her silences longer. The fire in her chambers burned low, but she would not draw near it. The bed remained untouched. She refused to lie down. And in those last weeks, no one dared ask why. The truth was simpler than prophecy, and darker than myth. Elizabeth knew that to rest was to be replaced. She had always ruled through motion, through progresses and performances, processions and speeches. She had wrapped herself in the myth of immortality, convinced a nation that its queen did not age, did not falter, did not bleed. But the body does not wait for permission. Her bones ached. Her teeth had gone. Her breath came short, wet with the scent of dying organs. Her hands trembled when no one was looking. And yet she stood, sometimes for hours, sometimes the entire day, sometimes into the cold, black reaches of night. She stood in velvet and pearls, alone in a room that knew too much, refusing food, refusing light, refusing the final gesture of defeat to lie down. Her ladies-in-waiting begged her to rest. Physicians offered potions. Priests offered prayers. Musicians played lute songs meant to lull her into sleep. But Elizabeth only stared at the tapestries or at some distant thing beyond them. She saw shadows that no one else could see. She spoke to men who were long dead. Dudley, Cecil, Essex. Her days were shorter, her silences longer. The fire in her chambers burned low, but she would not draw near it. The bed remained untouched. She refused to lie down. And in those last weeks, no one dared ask why. The truth was simpler than prophecy, and darker than myth. Elizabeth knew that to rest was to be replaced. She had always ruled through motion, through progresses and performances, processions and speeches. She had held England in her grip for 45 years, and never once allowed anyone to see the terror that lived beneath her crown. But now the flesh would no longer obey. She had not eaten in days. She had not slept in longer. Her legs gave out beneath her. And for the first time in decades, Elizabeth fell. They carried her to the cushions. Not to her bed, she would not allow it. She lay instead upon a pile of silks, propped up like a monument to her own myth, swaddled in layers to disguise how little remained beneath. Her face had caved inward. Her voice came in gasps. Her mouth twisted at odd angles. One side slack, the other clenched. They could no longer paint over her collapse. The mask had cracked, and beneath it was not a goddess, not a queen, not even a woman, only a memory trying to hold its shape. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived to pray at her side. But she did not speak. When asked who should succeed her, she gave no name, only a gesture. Some claimed she raised a hand. Others claimed her eyes flicked upward once toward the name already whispered in every chamber of court, James of Scotland. But no words came. The voice that had commanded Europe, defeated kings, seduced parliaments, and shattered dynasties, was gone. For hours she lay in silence. Then days. They watched her slip further into some realm beyond reach, where the crown no longer mattered, and no throne could follow. Her lips turned blue. Her skin shrank. The heat of her breath vanished. She refused communion. She refused comfort. She refused everything but stillness. And still she did not die. The court grew restless. They waited in chambers with drawn curtains, holding letters drafted days earlier, waiting to release the truth to a waiting world. The guards stood longer shifts. The physicians lied with hopeful faces, but the truth was already a storm behind their eyes. Elizabeth Tudor, England's eternal queen. The virgin. The survivor. The woman who had turned pain into empire was vanishing, and England was beginning to dream of kings again. It happened in the deep hours of morning. The women in her service heard her breathing slow, then stop. No cry, no gasping end, just a breath that did not return. Her hands, once ringed with jewels, curled inward. Her eyes, rimmed with ash and fear, did not close. And the room, so long deprived of sleep, went quiet for the first time in weeks. They wrapped her in linen and carried her body away. Outside, the river carried the rumor faster than the horses. Elizabeth was dead. She had reigned for 44 years and 96 days. She had outlived every Tudor before her. She had ruled longer than any monarch in English memory. She would not leave that same blade for another. So she ruled on, alone, unmarried, without heir, without comfort. Her ladies grew weary. The music in court grew thinner. And in her chambers, Elizabeth began to remove the portraits that showed her as a goddess. She preferred the ones in shadow, the ones that could not be seen clearly. She had grown tired of her own reflection, because beneath the paint, the white lead was poisoning her. Her skin peeled in flakes. Her hair fell in clumps. Her eyes, rimmed with ash and fear, did not close. And the room, so long deprived of sleep, went quiet for the first time in weeks. They wrapped her in linen and carried her body away. Outside, the river carried the rumor faster than the horses. Elizabeth was dead. She had reigned for 44 years and 96 days. She had outlived every Tudor before her. She had ruled longer than any monarch in English memory, and in the end, the throne rolled gently from her fingers into the hands of the very bloodline she tried to erase. But there was no rebellion, no fire, no grief that shook the earth. England did not weep in the streets. The bells tolled in mourning, but the people did not scream. They moved on quietly, efficiently, as though the spell had finally broken, and the kingdom remembered that it could live without her, and that, more than any dagger, any plot, any papal bull or Spanish armada, was the cruelest thing of all. For so long, Elizabeth had been the center of every breath in England. She had been the mother, the bride, the warrior, the goddess. She had demanded loyalty, worship, sacrifice. She had turned herself into a myth so radiant and blinding that none dared look directly at her. But myths die differently than mortals. They do not fade slowly, do not wither in beds, do not confess. They fracture, they vanish, and they are replaced by silence. When the court prepared her body, it took hours to strip away the paint. Beneath the white lead was skin like parchment. Beneath the pearls, bonus. Beneath the wig, a bariscalp. They dressed her in gold and laid her in state, beneath a canopy hung with the Tudor rose. But those who filed past her casket saw not the Virgin Queen. They saw what she had spent 45 years trying to hide, a woman who had exhausted herself into immortality, who had kept the kingdom alive by killing everything inside herself. Her funeral was magnificent. The procession stretched for miles. The coffin, draped in black velvet, was topped with an effigy, so lifelike that people swore it blinked. Trumpets cried out. Horses stamped in rhythm. Bishops in crimson and gold whispered her virtues. The streets were choked with onlookers who had never known another monarch. And yet beneath the spectacle, there was a stillness, a strange, fragile quiet, like a breath held too long. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the same tomb as her half-sister Mary, the very woman who had once tried to kill her. Their bones now lie together beneath an inscription that names only Elizabeth. Mary's name was erased from the lid of the stone, just as Elizabeth had once erased her from court, even in death. She could not allow her enemies to share the light. But the light did not last. James arrived quickly. His court, his accent, his manner all strange to the English. But he brought a son, and another, and another, a line of heirs that soothed the nerves of a country exhausted by the uncertainty Elizabeth had wielded like a weapon. And so the crown moved on. Parliament moved on. The people moved on. And Elizabeth began to vanish. They stopped printing her face on coins. Some said Elizabeth mourned him, that she kept a ring he had once given her, that she whispered his name when no one was listening. But whether that was grief or legend, no one could tell, because the queen who had once wept for Dudley had learned, by now, to bleed only inside. The court moved on. The calendar turned. The country breathed without him. But something inside Elizabeth did not. She grew colder. Not in policy, those had long since been made icy and precise, but in spirit. The teenager who endured assault, exile, and betrayal, and gave the world only silence in return. The queen who murdered her cousin to save her country, and then spent the rest of her life dreaming of her face. She was the survivor who refused to die. Even when death came with lace and poetry, and courtly smiles, and though the empire she helped build would stretch across oceans, would conquer and enslave and rise on the bones of millions. Elizabeth had ruled before the empire existed. Her power was not measured in colonies. It was measured in how long she kept the throne from slipping, in how she turned every insult bastard, heretic, whore, witch into a title, in how she bent history until it broke beneath her. But power that survives too long becomes its own prison. By the end, Elizabeth had outlived everything but the mask. And when the final breath left her, so too did the myth. What remained was quiet. What remained was England,